Mr. Clarke's back. Time to take a look at 18.2, the women's rights movement. Some of the objectives we'll be looking at in this particular section we'll look at and analyze why a movement to expand women's political rights arose in the 1960s. You could also kind of reflect as to why it took so long. We'll identify the goals and methods that political organizations use to promote women's rights. We'll assess the impact of the women's movement on American society. So the first thing we'll do is we'll define feminism, which is question number one. This is advocating for the political, social, and economic equality of women and men. So basically, they make sure that there's no difference in terms of how men and women are treated within society. Two, where are the origins of the women's equality movement traced back to? So this is kind of a historical question. If you reflect back in history, women for a long period of time during the 1700s and 1800s were fighting for abolition, which then ended slavery, for equal rights for African Americans. And then in the middle 1800s, during the 1840s, they kind of realized that some of the rights they were fighting for African Americans were some of the same rights they as women also lacked. So if you go back to 1848, which is the answer to number two, the Declaration of Sentiments, which was issued in July of 1848. This included Elizabeth Cady Stanton, later on Susan B. Anthony, Lucretia Mott, and many other women's rights leaders who were working towards this broader goal of bringing equality and equal rights to and for women. The second phase of feminism, question three, well, with the passage of the 19th Amendment in 1920, and so that was an easy way to remember, 1920, so the 19th Amendment passed in 1920, so we kind of divide them up, 19/20, this is the 19th Amendment in 20. So really just 100 years ago or so, women were granted the right to vote. Their first election that they voted for a presidential candidate is 1920, when women overwhelmingly supported Republican candidate Warren G. Harding and his vice presidential nominee, Calvin Coolidge. Four, what events in the 40s, the 50s, the 60s led to the need for a second wave of feminism? 1940s, women gained jobs and confidence during World War II. When men were away at war, they stepped up and handled a lot of the difficult jobs, handled them well, and really proved themselves to be equal to men during World War II. 1950s, people wanted a return to normalcy, very similar to the campaign after World War I. And the image of the ideal woman was returned to the stereotypical housewife role, where they got married, they cooked and cleaned and took care of the children, the triple C's. And really that was not something that many women were satisfied with. Eventually, women are going to rebel against this and attempt to reverse some of these restrictions. 1960 civil rights movement inspired many women to fight for their rights as well. Similar to abolition in the middle 1800s, in the middle 1900s, the civil rights movement really brought women in as well. Five, why did some leaders of the feminist movement use the phrase Jane Crow to motivate people to act? They wanted to draw a connection between racial equality and gender equality. Obviously, the Jim Crow laws were the segregationist rules and regulations that were keeping African Americans and whites separate, in particular in the South. The civil rights movement had been relatively successful and inspired many people. So the women's rights movement wanted to kind of profit from that momentum, kind of jump on the bandwagon and kind of push forward with women's rights as well. Okay, number six. What aspects of the excerpt from The Feminist Mystique by Betty Friedan made her writing particularly powerful? Give examples. Well, Friedan used images and ideas that were very familiar to people in the 1950s. This included peanut butter sandwiches and Cub Scouts and things like that. They helped to convey her idea that the experiences she described were widespread. She really put forth that was pretty much that all women can inspire to be at that point in time, and that many women wanted more than simply making peanut butter sandwiches and attending scout meetings and such for their children. 7, why was the National Organization of Women established? Now, good name for a organization, because when do women want equal rights? Now. When should these changes occur? Now. When should we stand up for our rights? Now. So this kind of dedicated itself to true equality for women, attaining a full and equal partnership of the sexes. Now helped to galvanize or bring together large numbers of women during the women's movement. What methods did Now use to facilitate change? Very similar methods to what we've seen in other protest movements throughout history. They protested and marched in large numbers. They used petitions. They lobbied Congress to pass laws that guaranteed women's rights and equality. They had small-scale conscientious raising efforts or conscious raising efforts to kind of get people to move forward. Nine, what did the Equal Rights Amendment state? The equality of rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or any state on the account of sex. It was passed in Congress but failed to get ratified by 3/4 of the states in the United States, which would have been 38 out of 50. So although the amendment passed scrutiny in the Congress, it did not meet the threshold of an amendment addition to the Constitution. Charlotte Bunch wrote that there is no private domain of a person's life that is not political, and there is no political issue that is not ultimately personal. Is this a statement you agree or disagree with? Obviously, this is your own opinion. So the issue of feminism and women's rights is hard to avoid. Every woman automatically has an interest in the women's rights movement, whether she is politically involved or not, because women's rights impact her personal life. So she's basically advocating here that even if you're very passive and not very aggressive in getting involved in the women's rights movement, the benefits of the women's rights movement will benefit you as an individual as well. One of the more famous women during the women's movement was Gloria Steinem, pictured above. She was quoted as saying, "A woman without a man is like a fish without an umbrella." If you don't get the meaning, it means that a woman does not need a man. How did Gloria Steinem impact the women's movement? She attempted to raise awareness in the media. Steinem did undercover reporting, published exposés on the unfair treatment of women, and she co-founded the feminist magazine Miss. A couple more images there of Gloria Steinem, as well as additional quotes. Quote from her, "I would say that each of us has only one thing to gain from the feminist movement, our whole humanity." There's a cover of the magazine with Gloria Steinem on the cover. Do any aspects of the women's rights seem too extreme to appeal to all women? Not everyone agreed that women should have the right to have an abortion, for example. There's still some, especially on the Christian right, who still oppose abortion, and they're pro-life in their views and beliefs. Other feminist goals, such as addressing women as Ms. and outlawing sex-segregated bathrooms, did not seem to appeal to all women. A conservative counterpart to Gloria Steinem was Phyllis Schlafly. She argued that equal rights were harmful to American families. She believed that if women began to work full-time jobs outside the home, as men did, they would neglect their families, their marriage, and children would both suffer. Now, obviously, that's something that's been proven to be a false statement, but that was the mindset and the belief system of some people during that period of time in history. (14) How did the women's movement impact American society? Women's roles and opportunities expanded. Women gained long denied legal rights. 15, why was Roe v. Wade considered a civil rights decision? Women's ability to join the workforce depended on their ability to control when and how they had children. Pro-choice advocates believe that if women were able to have abortions legally, they would have more control over their lives. So that's the connection that they made there. Title IX required colleges to have better opportunities for women in athletics. What mixed consequences did this have? Most of the effects of Title IX were positive because participation of women in athletics rose dramatically. However, inequality in collegiate athletics still exists because so many of the coaches are still men. How has Title IX legislation impacted high school sports? Girls are now entitled to have an equivalent sport to a corresponding boys' team at the high school level. So, for example, baseball and softball, if the school lacks an equivalent sport, girls are permitted to try out for the boys' team. So if there's only a boys' soccer team, then the girls can play in the girls could also try out for the boys' soccer team. But because there's a split of the sport with a boy and girls team, then therefore you have to play in your equivalent gender-based team. Over the past 50 years now, we've seen a dramatic increase in the number of young women participating in sports. 8, how have things improved for women in the workforce since 1950? In 1950, 30% of women were in the workforce, but by 2000 it had expanded to 60%, more than double. Women have seen more and more opportunities in things like medicine, law, and finance. Explain the relationship between the pink-collar ghetto and the feminization of poverty. The pink-collar ghetto has caused the feminization of poverty because women often work in fields that pay less. It's very difficult for a single woman to support a family on a lower salary. So there's still a finance or a pay gap between men and women. What hidden causes led to women getting paid less than men? Female-dominated fields such as teaching or social work tend to pay less than male-dominated fields such as finance or engineering. Additionally, many women end up dropping out of the workforce when they have children. Many women want jobs that require more flexibility so they can help out their families. However, flexible jobs usually don't pay as much as kind of highly competitive, long-hour jobs. Finally, the lesson reflection. Have women achieved true equality in society today? If not, why? What areas do we still need to see improvement? Legally, on paper, you can say they have, but in reality, there's still a gender bias and gap within the society. Politically, they have made tremendous strides. We have our first female vice president of the United States of America and Vice President Harris. Women still average a lower average salary per year than men, so there are still some areas in which women still need to kind of step forward and kind of reach true equality. Hopefully you enjoyed our discussions here today on the women's rights movement. Until next time, Mr. Clarke is out.